Welcome back to the Annihihate podcast, a forum to discuss and combat student hate. Today we have a compassionate and charismatic guest joining us. Mr. Ron Kim is the current headmaster of the Bishop's School, uh, the school which Joyce and I proudly attend. Prior to his role at Bishop's, Mr. Kim was the assistant principal and history instructor at the Phillips Exeter Academy for 23 years. Welcome, Mr. Kim.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So would you like to tell us a little bit on your background? For example, things like where you grew up and why you decided to get into teaching?
Sure, happy to. So I was born in Korea and my family moved to the United States, Los Angeles area when I was 4 and went to public schools. Didn't have any knowledge at all about independent schools. It was nowhere in our imagination. And then I went to college and grad school and I took the unlikely path of studying history. Unlikely because, you know, Korean boys who are the only boy in the family typically don't pursue an area of study like that. But I really liked it. It was the one subject that really got my attention and my passion. And I thought it would be great to be a history professor. And then that transitioned into finding an opportunity to teach at independent schools, which had the kind of students I was hoping to teach. And so I was really fortunate. I ended up getting a job teaching history at Phillips Exeter Academy. And slightly contrary to the introduction, it took me a long time before I did anything other than teach. And it was a long time before I wanted to do anything other than that. So I spent most of the first half of my career teaching history, running a dormitory, coaching sports, really enjoying getting to know and supporting really bright, great young people. And then later on in my career, I had opportunities to move into administration. So I took a position in the dean of faculty office, and then that became an assistant head role. And then I had a couple of things in between before I became the head of the Bishop School. I am now in my third year and speaking to all of you.
So, as a former history teacher yourself, how do you feel about hate? Is it learned or is it something that just like comes within?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I have a few ways to think about that. Think about a quote from Desmond Tutu, who once said that, or I'm sorry, I think it was either Desmond Tutu or Nelson Mandela, some heroic South African man. I can't remember which one, but he said that people are not born to hate. That is something that they learn, and that was a quote that I found so compelling, and I wish I could make sure I knew who had said that. And I think about Brian Stevenson, who is head of the Equal Justice Initiative, and you probably know him through a movie that was made about him fairly recently. But he has worked really hard at releasing people who were wrongly jailed for crimes that they did not commit. And he talked about the importance of getting proximate, and what it meant that it's really hard to hate someone who you know well. It's easy to hate people who are kind of the abstract. And I think when we see incidents of violence or marginalization of one group by others, there are usually a couple of those elements involved. In some ways, directly or indirectly, people have been taught to hate another group. And the hate is inspired by just a lack of proximity or knowledge or sort of intimate relationships. So, yeah, that's how I see the historical construct of incidents like this when there's violence against a particular group.
Yeah, so it sounds like hate is definitely learned. Humans are not born to hate, but do you think that it can be corrected? And maybe is there a way that this translates in an educational setting, such as at the Bishop's School?
Yeah, I would like to believe that if it's something that is learned, then it can be unlearned, or people can learn to not hate. They can learn to, love the people around them instead of separate themselves and dislike them or feel violent towards them. So I definitely feel like that can be different. I don't think groups of people have to inherently develop, that kind of animus or tendency to violence. And I think educational institutions play a huge role in that, especially schools like ours, independent schools where we can be intentional about who goes to our school. So if you contrast that to, say, a public school, which can only admit the students who happen to live within their neighborhoods, we know that there are many places in this country that are racially segregated, and thus those schools tend to be racially segregated. And for a school like ours, where we can be intentional about who comes to our school, we can choose to some extent how diverse our student body is. And so all of our students can get used to being around other students who come from different racial backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different beliefs. They become your classmates, your teammates, your friends. And as I said earlier, you can't hate people who you get to be friends with, who you're close to. It demystifies the difference that we might think exists based on some perception of difference.
Seeing this, what do you think is like the most effective way to teach about anti-racism at home or at school?
One of the ironic issues right now is I think there is a fatigue sometimes in society in talking about race. There are attempts to make talking about critical race theory, as it's called, illegal. There are some people who feel like the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, has been focused on too much, or that the violence against Asians is not significant enough to merit so much attention. And yet, I think the way to combat racism is for people to talk about it more. It's not an easy topic to discuss. It's generally not a conversation starter. It's usually not something people like to talk about when they're just hanging out. But I think the most important thing for us to combat it is to be open about it. I think racism is a difficult topic for people in this country to discuss. And I think there are a few reasons for that. I think one is we like to believe that this is a country where all men are created equal and everyone can achieve if they just work hard. And I think in many ways that can be true. I told you about my background, and somehow I ended up becoming the head of the bishop school. So clearly there are opportunities, and a lot of other people have success stories as well. But there's no doubt that there is a linkage and correlation between race and opportunity, and race and success. And I think because of the ethos of this country about equality, the ability for each person to rise as far as they want, I think we want to believe that it's up to each individual, and that race shouldn't matter. And I agree. I think everyone agrees race shouldn't matter, but it still can matter, and it still does matter for lots of people. And I think that makes it hard sometimes for us to have conversations about that. I think this country has a collective shame about some of the things that have happened in the past. Native Americans were killed by the millions, and the lands that they were on are no longer their lands. We had centuries of slavery, and most ethnic groups that arrived to this country experienced some kind of backlash. And it's so contrary to the ideals of this country that I think talking about racism just weighs really heavily, because we don't want to believe that we have a country that had racism. And it makes it hard to talk about. But if we don't talk about it, then we're probably going to perpetuate the thing that we probably don't want to have continue.
Yep. And do you think so since this is such a difficult topic to talk about, but it is still necessary to talk to kids about these sorts of things, do you think that it is best to teach this at home or at school, whether the best way to talk about this would be like a student to student conversation, or teacher to student, or parent to student?
I think the best education, or the best kind of development, is when there is a shared concern and a shared partnership. So I think if we can all agree that racism or hate based on ethnic identity is wrong and something that we want to have stopped, then it's important for everyone to have a stake in that. So for families to be willing to talk about that, for us to be willing to talk about it at school, for friends to be able to talk about it. I'm thinking about a lesson that you all did in your DEIJ programming, where you talked about jokes and what's funny and what's not. It's moments like that friends can make a little bit of a difference in what is normalized. So I think we've all been in situations like this. Someone makes a joke or a comment, and it's meant to poke fun at some marginalized group. And in that moment, we think, well, maybe I'll just laugh along. I don't want to stand out. Or maybe I'll be quiet, and then because I don't want to call attention to it. But if we try to be an upstander and say, yeah, I don't think that's funny, or why do you think that's funny? Just to call out that that's not okay, that you're not going to help normalize that kind of behavior and attitude. And so it's in those moments, multiplied by 1,000, multiplied by millions, that I think you can start to change. So I think the answer to your question, Stephen, is it has to reside in all those areas, and have families and friends and school all believing this is something that we want to change.
Yeah, so it seems like if everyone thinks that I won't say anything about this, the next person will do it, then no one will actually do it. So everyone needs to take a stand and starts to speak out about this. And to clarify what DIJ is for some listeners out there who are perhaps not from Bishops, it is a program called Diversity, Equity, Inclusivity, and Justice that we have at our school. And we learn about all sorts of cultures and difficult topics that we want to talk about as a group with our advisory. And so the students like to call it Jedi, but it's technically DIJ.
He just stole my line. I was gonna say that. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, moving back to the more serious topic. So it's important to catch students in these moments where they're not being very, I don't know what's the right word for this, but when students are just not doing the right thing, especially when it comes to such serious topics like racism. Do you think it's best to start in elementary school, middle school, or high school?
Yeah, well, I think what you're mentioning, Joyce, are those moments where there's some expression of racism or marginalization or prejudice. And I think the expression is just sort of at the tip of the iceberg, right? It's what led that person to even think that that's something that they wanted to say, and they think that's even funny. And so I think that gets your question about when does this kind of stuff best get taught. And I was reading this book by Shankar Vedantam called The Hidden Brain. I don't know if anybody has ever heard that podcast. Of course, your podcast is the one people should listen to, but this is another podcast. And it was a fascinating compilation of some of his episodes. And one of them was about how babies identify faces that are familiar and unfamiliar. And they start to recognize the faces that they start to identify as trusting. So, for example, I have two kids. They saw my face and started to recognize that someone who looks like me is a loving face, someone who will take care of them. If they saw another face, if they saw someone who was brown or black, they would have a reaction that was a little bit more suspicious. And to some extent, so there's a reflex that even infants have about what feels familiar and safe. And so it requires a little bit of active, active approaches to make sure that little kids are seeing people from lots of different backgrounds, just so they can develop that instinctive sense that, okay, people from all walks of life, right, all different appearances, are people who can be loving people. And so to answer your question, Joyce, I think it starts really early. Probably a lot is ingrained in what happens the first few years, who you are around, the kind of media you start to absorb. I see lots of little kids with iPads and grocery carts. I'm wondering what kind of games are they playing? Who's represented in those games? What kind of subtle messages are they receiving that way? And so I think by the time that they're in school, in kindergarten or so, they've probably unintentionally developed all kinds of assumptions. And I think then it just requires just kind of a proactive, conscious awareness that it will be helpful for kids to see that there are role models, there are loving people who look like all kinds of different people around the world who may not look quite like you.
Yeah, so what I'm getting is it's good to expose children at a young way. Not gonna say it's like exposure therapy, but like just getting in their eyes, in their head that there are like there's such a wide variety of people living here.
Yeah,
So
and yeah, I think you put it very succinctly and better than I did, Joyce. The degree to which one can live in a diverse community or participate in a diverse community versus a homogenous one can have a real impact on the attitudes and beliefs that one develops. It's often, I think, subconsciously.
yeah, so since Bishops is middle to high school and there's not really a chance to reach to children that young, what kind of resources exist for students like at Bishops looking to better understand other cultures and backgrounds?
Yeah, I think one of the things, as I said before, is we're an intentional community. So students apply to Bishops, and there are various criteria for them to get in. One of the obvious ones is academic preparation. This is a school with high expectations, and we want students who want to achieve academically. Yeah, but that's not the only one. Another one is we want to be really intentional about who is going to be part of this community. So Bishops is an Episcopal school, and it has as a result, it has a firm commitment towards inclusion and a belief that everyone is deserving of love. And so part of what's really important is that we have students not only who are academically capable, but in our admissions process to make it clear to them, this is an Episcopal school, and what that means primarily is that you have to really firmly believe that you're going to treat everyone well, right? You're going to be kind to everyone, not just people who are like you. And of course, if you ask kids in an admissions process, are you going to be nice to other people? They'll generally say yes. But what we want to make sure is that there is a real strong commitment among the kids who want to be at Bishops to make a difference, to be kind to others who are not bystanders but upstanders, who maybe have ways that they've talked about how they've tried to make things better in areas of diversity, equity, inclusion, or justice. And you might think, well, what does that even mean? Like, what would that mean for a 10-year-old or something? But they can tell you. They can tell you if there have been moments where they've been in groups with other races, or when there's comments made and what they did and how they reacted. So that's one answer to your question, Joyce, is part of the way we construct the educational process at Bishops is to make sure we have kids who believe in these kinds of values. And then beyond that, it's good for us to be really mindful of the teachers we hire, to try to be as diverse as we can in who is in the front of the classroom. Again, they need to be really good at the subjects they teach, but they also have to believe in these values too, and to believe that their ability to make sure that they're supporting a diverse community is a really high priority for them. And then it gets down to the curriculum. There are topics that we teach, books that we read, conversations that we have, and extracurricular activities, and the well-being block, and how we can continue to accentuate and build on these topics. Chapel 2 is another great opportunity for us to continue to affirm these values. So I think we can do a lot on the educational end, but I also think that where students learn so much is just in the behaviors and the the relationships and the everyday experience. So I think people often think about the direct education one gets from the classroom, but so much more is affirmed in the times in between, the times after school, during a lunch break, and the kind of conversations that people engage in. I think those are really reinforcing.
And I think it's great that we have such a selected community, such a diverse community that of students who believe they can make a difference. And some of these students, not including me, unfortunately, but some of these students have taken it upon themselves to make clubs at school that represent different cultures. And I think this is a great resource that can be used for students who are not from that culture and from that culture to gather and explore and celebrate the different cultures we have on campus. So maybe to set a model for other schools or to sort of talk about this so more students are aware. But how do you think these numerous culture clubs that we have can make a difference, and how do those clubs how can those clubs maximize their impact in our community and beyond?
Yeah, one of the things I do every year is I try to attend a club meeting at least once a year with every one of the affinity groups. And that's been really enjoyable. And sometimes everyone in the affinity space is represented by their beliefs or by their race, right? And sometimes it's an ally. And I think that's awesome that people are there because they want to be supportive and they want to learn. I really enjoyed the conversations that happened there, and even more so, I really appreciate the level of comfort that these students have in, first of all, having a club, second, in identifying themselves as a member of that group, and then when they're together, it's really fun to see how comfortable they are. That they're not trying to explain what their group means. They're not trying to explain why some issues are on their minds. And so it's just a really nice supportive group. And I really appreciated watching the social dynamics in those settings. I think one can maybe participate. I think this is your question, Stephen. I think one can participate in some of these groups and to join. But I would ask if they feel okay, if it's not a group to which you might normally belong or naturally belong, to make sure that they feel okay, because they may want it as just a safe space, or they might welcome somebody coming in who has an interest. And I think probably at Bishops is going to be more of the latter.
Yeah, it's great that students have taken it upon themselves. But for teachers, so based on your previous experience, as you noted, you were a history teacher for the first part of your career at Philip Exeter. How do you think history at Bishops could build on helping students better understand different cultures and help better stop hate?
Yeah, I was just reading one of my heroes. Was a history professor I had at Berkeley. This guy named Leon Litwack, who was a white Jewish man who spent most of his career researching and writing about Black people during and after slavery. And I had the good accidental fortune of taking a history class with him my freshman year at Berkeley. And I still remember so vividly his lectures. He was an incredible storyteller, so scholarly, but also accessible. And he passed away recently at the age of 91. And there's been a lot of outpouring of appreciation and mourning. I know that another history teacher at the Bishops, Jeff Gahagan, was at Berkeley and took his class, and so we talked about how much he meant to us. One of the things that was said about him when he passed was how much he helped all of us understand that history is about understanding people, not yourself. It's about understanding others, and inherent in that is a lot of empathy. what has been the experience of other people, what have been their struggles and their opportunities. And that's one of the incredible values of history. And it's probably, as a discipline, also made me a better person because I've had to think about what life is like from another person's perspective. And so I think when history is taught well, that is what it communicates to you. It's about the experience that other people had, how they overcame it or not, how they suffered, how they persevered. And I think if we can convey that in our history classes, that will be one way I think that we can make a difference in the way people see the world and how they see they can make an impact just in their relationships with other people.
Yep. And I think, as you have said earlier, the fact that in this country, the history in or in the past, there have been instances of horrible instances of racism, such as slavery and things. I think. Do you think that if we really opened up, and talked about the history, like the past of the events, that maybe it'll make it easier to talk about how we can prevent this from happening again in the future, or just in general talk about it? I think.
Yeah, I think that when you avoid something, it typically doesn't work out well. And if, as a society, as a group of American people, if there are things that we just don't want to talk about, but is still so relevant, it makes it really difficult. And I think all of us have been in relationships or families or groups where there's some issue that is on our minds and it just is really tough to talk about. And it's hard to make progress in so many areas if you feel like you have to avoid such an important topic like that. And I think the more awareness we have about what has happened in the past can help us understand how we can avoid it in the future. I'm not a believer that history repeats itself, but there are some patterns that we can recognize. And I think sometimes terrible things can have pretty modest beginnings. And the more we can understand how these things emerge and what we can do about them, I think that's helpful.
Mhm. Also, I can't speak from experience personally, but I'm gonna just put myself in someone else's shoes, just as you said. Resources exist. What resources exist for students who feel like they have been targeted or marginalized or even inadvertently mistreated based on their race, orientation, gender, or religion at schools or even outside of schools?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on this matter. Uh, I think it would, first, it's really great if you can talk to your parents about it. And I think sometimes Asian parents can be hard to talk to about these kinds of topics. Uh, Asians are stereotypically about not making waves, just work hard, just suck it up, which is a term that I've used a lot with my kids. And you'll be okay. You can't change everything. Just persevere. And I think one thing that parents can do is just be really good listeners. If you experience something that made you feel a certain way, it would be really helpful for you to be able to talk about it with your parents. I think it'd be really helpful for parents, Asian parents, to share with their kids. Yeah, here's what I've experienced, right? And sometimes I think it's hard for Asian parents to talk about these things because it feels embarrassing, feels shameful. There's a desperate desire not to have you experience the same kind of things that they did. And so, maybe if we don't raise the issue, maybe you won't experience it, which I know is not true. So I think that's the first most important resource, is for you to be able to say to your parents, hey, this is what happened to me, or what happened with you. And for you to feel like you can raise this topic there. I think social groups are enormously important. For you to have a friend group where they love you for who you are and you don't feel like you have to compromise your identity in some way. It's really great to have a teacher or some other adult in your life with whom you can share experiences that you have that you think is of any kind, but including any kind of race-based experience, for you to know that there's someone who you can talk to who trusts, who will listen, will understand. I think those things are critically important um, for us to make sure that we have a diverse group of adults on campus so that students can see someone who might know what they've experienced or what you've experienced. I think that's really important. And then you get into other areas that I know increasingly less about, as far as counseling resources or organizational resources or political groups. Those things are important too. And I think the most important thing is to make sure that you have a loving support group around you.
And it's very important, as you said, like to have this general to have some sort of safe space where you can talk, where you can open up and talk about anything that's made you feel marginalized or not safe. And it's really scary when you can't do that with your own parents. But I think, as you said, having someone who can connect to you can be really helpful. So this is kind of a question that is very current. So over COVID, especially over the year of 2020, it's been really hard to connect with a lot of people, partially due to the what we had when we had the lockdown, but also not being able to see other people very often. So some people might be lacking that human connection that can
Mhm.
only be felt when people are connecting person to person. So do you have any sort of resources for people like that? Maybe like, yeah.
Well, I think you point out a reality that is unfortunate. That I think the last 2 years we've had a greater degree of social isolation than we would want. That's had all kinds of costs. It's had some learning loss issues, maybe less for our students and more so for students in other schools. There's been some mental health and psychological issues that came from that, and I think there's a cost that you described, Stephen, where the ability to connect and have trusting relationships with lots of different people, that's been more difficult lately. And I wish I had a solution for that. I think one of the um, to put on a public health statement here, if people all get vaccinated and wear masks, you can do most of the things that you might want to do otherwise. And so I hope we get back to being that kind of society. The other thing I would say is, if we go back to the way we were, we shouldn't presume that that was really great, right? I mean, some of the issues you're talking about now existed before COVID. I think there isolation existed before. I think groups who were not integrating or getting to know anyone else, that existed before. So I wouldn't idealize the past, but I will say that this past couple of years has made a lot of things harder.
Yeah, moving a little bit forward, so at our school, we use chapel as a way to communicate and discuss larger topics. And I know during the pandemic, we did it online, so we had recorded videos and of students like sharing or like doing a musical presentation, and then we had the live chapel council speaking in chapel. So I know in I believe 2020 or 2021, after the Atlanta attacks, a very unfortunate event, there was a chapel talk for Asian students to open about their experiences as an Asian student or in America. And although I see many of my classmates appreciating and seeing this representation, I was a middle schooler at the time, so actually the chapel talk was not available for me, and I was not able to witness it. And I was a little bit sad because I was like, I want to hear people talking about this issue because I am also an Asian student in America. So how do you think the situation could improve? And is there anything, do you think there could have been anything that explores this unfortunate topic a bit more among all the grades?
Well, I think you are getting at an interesting point here, which is sometimes our desire to speak on something is a reaction to an event, and often an unfortunate one. And I think what you're pointing out is, yeah, that we spoke about it in chapel, but you were in middle school and you missed it. And maybe one thing that would be helpful is if Asian students said to our chaplain, hey, can we have at least one chapel a year that's devoted to some theme that represents our identity? And I think she would say, yes, that'd be a great idea. I'd love to do that. Just so it doesn't come up only when something bad happens, right? And so, and I think we want to be as intentional as we can. I think our DEIJ program, which Steven explained earlier what that means, does a good job of trying to be proactive and establish the community that we want. And for us to also include in our chapel program some regular opportunities for Asian students and Asian adults. And I think that would be great. One thing I want to note about what you referenced, Joyce, about what happened in Atlanta. So you're referencing the murder of a number of Asian women, right, by a white male assailant. And after that happened, David Thompson, who is our director of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, reached out to me and he said, should we put out a school statement? And these moments are challenging. There is something bad that happens to some group almost every day. And he and I talk about how we could write something almost every day, which is unfortunate, but true. And in that case, it seemed like we did need to write something. And it was hard for me as an Asian person. It was hard for me to write. I can often put myself into the space of communicating, of creating an intellectual framework, trying to come up with the right words to respond to an issue. And this one struck me at a more personal level, and I found it hard to figure out how to respond. And so David Thompson, who is a Black male, he wrote it. He wrote the response on this attack against Asian women. And it reminded me, after the George Floyd murder in the spring of 2020, it was really hard for David to write about it. And so I wrote it because it mattered to me. And I knew it was difficult for him at a personal level. You know, when we talked earlier about, you know, being proximate and being loving and supportive of people unlike you, you know, David Thompson and I are very different by age, by race, by upbringing. But he's my friend and I take care of him. You know, he takes care of me.
That is incredibly sweet. And I think to your point that there are attacks almost every day, I think that is very important to note that during the interview that we had with Christina Liu a couple weeks back, almost a month now, is it?
I would say maybe
Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, during that interview we talked about how media only covers certain stories that look good on the front page, and I think it's just or not even look good on the front page, just are selective about these attacks. And I think all cases like these deserve a voice. And the main reason that we were even alerted of the Atlanta attack was because of the news. It was brought up, it made national news. It was a huge deal. But I think that all of these cases should deserve a voice. And now that we've heard more about your response and Mr. Thompson's response on this, we think it's very appropriate what you did. You really did the best that you could. So thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that. It's hard to know what's enough. It's hard to know what difference the words make, but I appreciate that. I think we're all trying to do our best.
Yeah, so seeing how the school is working very hard to help us students, how do us students ourselves stand up and take action to combat hate inside and outside of their communities?
Well, I think this podcast is certainly a element of something that you're doing that's proactive. I think the activities that we have at our school, the extent to which you participate in them and support them, I think is important. One of the things that I struggle with a little bit. So my wife is she's Caucasian. But she does a lot of diversity work. That's a lot of what her consulting practice is about. And she and I talked a lot about how we make a difference in this area. And we've talked more about how difficult it is to try to get to beliefs. If, for example, if someone has a prejudice belief or a racist belief, uh, trying to change that belief is difficult. And maybe what's more important is to change behavior. And changed behavior can change beliefs. It may work more effectively that way. And so, to our comment earlier about being an upstander, or making sure that you have as much of a diverse friend group or diverse social groups as possible. Those kinds of behaviors, I think, will drive beliefs, and then I think people will then feel an obligation to be supportive of people who are not like them. Maybe the kind of thing that Mr. Thompson and I did, for each other. So I think that you are doing more than I think most people your age do, more than most people of any age do. And so I would encourage you to just keep doing what you're doing, to care, to talk, and remind people that this is an issue.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yep. So thank you for this incredibly insightful podcast with us, time with us. I think what you said was incredibly useful because taking a stand together, this is a message that we hope to spread with our podcast, because hopefully people listen to it and they become inspired to take similar actions against hate, against prejudice or marginalization. They go out there and make friends that they have never met before from different cultures, and certainly be able to talk about difficult conversations while remaining respectful and with the intention in mind, not to denounce things that have already happened, but to look to the future and combat hate in that way, to prevent this, be proactive.
Yeah, that sounds great to me, and I would just encourage you to keep caring, keep believing that change is possible, because I think it is, but only if you continue to care and act towards a better world.